I spend a lot of time in Agave Utahensis habitat, and I've seen thousands and thousands of flowering and previously flowered Agave Utahensis plants. And except for a very small handful of them, they all conform to the same rules, that agave is monocarpic. It flowers and then dies, and then the plant dries up and disappears into the desert. But in a very small number of cases, they produce what I like to call auxiliary stalks, which are some of the strangest, weirdest looking tiny little stalks, sometimes even from entirely dead plants. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is Agave Utahensis auxiliary stalks. Now, I feel like I say this in every video, but Agave Utahensis is monocarpic. That means it flowers once in its life and then it dies. And when it flowers, it produces a 10, 12, 15-foot flower stalk from what is rarely ever more than maybe a 12-inch plant at its base, right? And it does this in a single season, so it's super dramatic. There's a whole bunch of really bright yellow flowers on it. They produce copious amounts of nectar. They attract all sorts of pollinators. Moths are the primary pollinators, but certainly bees like them, hummingbirds like them, all sorts of stuff like them. And yeah, and so it's really cool to see this when it happens. Generally, it happens in the spring. I've seen a couple of plants in habitat where it's happened later in the season, in the fall. You kind of got to feel bad for them because Agave Utahensis is most likely an obligate outcrosser, meaning it needs to pollinate with something else in order to produce seeds. So if a plant is flowering at a time of year when there aren't a whole lot of other plants also flowering, then it's probably not going to get pollinated by a different plant. And so it may not produce seeds at all or very many seeds. And again, after this process happens, and actually throughout the year of it happening, through the spring and the summer and the fall of the year that the plant flowers, the leaves at the base, the rosette of the agave, which are normally green or bluish in the case of Nevadensis, start turning yellow. They start sort of, honestly, it's kind of like the process of watching leaves turn yellow and orange in the autumn. Right? And it's actually really cool to see. I've taken some photos and some videos of some plants in habitat that's happening to. But after flowering is done, if seeds are going to be produced when they're produced, the plant is dead. Again, it's monocarpic, right? So once it flowers, it dies. And then over the next couple of years in habitat, the leaves all dry up, they desiccate, and then eventually they entirely decompose and the whole plant sort of disappears. But what's really interesting about auxiliary stalks is that they buck that trend, right? They grow either multiple stalks per plant, or at least it looks like there's multiple stalks per plant. They're usually a whole lot smaller, maybe 12, 18 inches, 24 inches, 2 feet, something around that range, if that big actually. And then sometimes they can actually appear to be growing from at least what look like entirely dead plants. So they seem to challenge some of those monocarpic rules, and I find them really, really fascinating when I find them in habitat, because I do find them in habitat. One out of maybe every couple of hundred or so flowering plants that I see has auxiliary stalks. I call them aux stalks because it rhymes, and they don't really have a much better, and they don't really have a better name for them yet. But I've talked to a couple of experts. Their suggestions is that it has to do with essentially plant hormones, which are called auxins. So that's another reason to call them aux stalks. But what it looks like is that they're actually small stalks produced by entirely underground offset. So Agave Utahensis also reproduces vegetatively, asexually, by producing rhizomal offsets, that is clones that are growing from its root system. And apparently in some cases, clones don't fully emerge from the ground and that are still attached to the root system. And those are what's flowering in the case of auxiliary stalks. At least this is one explanation that's been given to me. And I think it explains a lot of the cases that I've seen, because in a lot of them, the stalk is seemingly growing from the bottom or the side of the plant where a hidden underground offset would be. There are a couple of special cases, though, where it appears that the aux stalk, or one of them, is growing from the center of the plant. And I suppose that could be growing through the leaves from an underground rosette. And then in some other cases, it looks like nearly solitary plants that have been long since dead. You can see where their flower stalk was at least a year, maybe a couple of years before I photographed it. and there are still a number of auxiliary stalks coming from it that are green off of a completely dead and dried out desiccated plant. So I find it a little bit hard to believe that in that case that there is a hidden underground offset that's been under there for years and it's just now started to flower. But I suppose it's possible, and I'm kind of new to a lot of this stuff. I'm just a big nerd about it. So I would love to know what you think down in the comments. What do you think causes these auxiliary stalks, these aux stalks? Do you think it is an underground, hidden underground offset? I do think it probably is, but I would love to hear if there are any other potential explanations that you guys all have. And then have you ever actually seen one of these? Has one of your plants in cultivation produced one? Have you seen an Agave Utahensis in the wild with one? Have you seen it on a different species of agave?